Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us on this occasion. This is an evening, as you know, dedicated to an issue that has seen the Italian government on the forefront in the international scene. That's the death penalty. Italy is, in fact, a recognized leader of the battle against the death penalty. It was a little over 20 years ago, in 1994, that Italy proposed for the first time to the United Nations a universal moratorium on the death penalty. It was only in 1999 that the European Union joined Italy's position, and 8 years later, finally, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the suspension of the death penalty for 2 years. In 2012, a similar resolution was also approved, and last year, also Secretary General Ban Ki-moon supported the moratorium, stressing again that the death penalty has no place in the 21st century. So you see, the consensus around the idea of a moratorium has been building. Our government has continued to actively promote initiatives aimed at strengthening the support for it, and eventually, for the complete abolition of the death penalty. These efforts of the Italian government are shared also by many NGOs, such as Comunità di Sant'Egidio in Italy, as well as by Amnesty International and Death Penalty Focus, and by millions of people around the globe. And I should say that our commitment is well rooted in history. It was in 1764 that the great politician philosopher Cesare Beccaria argued in his On Crime and Punishment that the death penalty is not rational and it's neither useful nor necessary. The first state to take heed on Beccaria's reasoning was the Great Duchy of Tuscany, and that was 1786. Fast forward to today, we have the distinct pleasure to have with us tonight the very person who has made the fight against the death penalty one of his life's battles. The person who 15 years ago delivered that momentum petition to Secretary of the United Nations Kofi Annan, the Honorable Marazziti. And he has long been committed to a vision of justice where capital punishment has no place. So it's an honor for us to have him address this audience in a few minutes. And I'd like to thank you all again for being here today, for your support. I'd like also to thank the panelists that will join us in a few moments here on the podium. And once again, thank you very much, Honorable Marazziti, for your commitment, for your strength, for your willingness. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks again to the Consul General of Italy, and thank you, Mario Marazziti, for being here with us. I'd like to introduce also another special guest of honor tonight, Italian actress Maddalena Schiale. Already a stage, TV, and film actress in Italy, Maddalena's breakthrough performance as the long-suffering mother of US Olympian and Second World War hero, Italian-American era, I should say, Louise Zamperini, has received international acclaim. The movie is a testimony of Angelina Jolie's humanitarian commitment. Maddalena studied acting in Rome. She played her first role with Robert Everett in Cemetery Man and began a national tour of The Diary of Anna Frank. She earned a master's degree in acting and directing from Emilia-Romagna Teatro, and she continued her career. Maddalena was invited by Academy Award-winning actor Martin Landau to become one of the few foreign finalists at the prestigious Actors Studio in Los Angeles, where she's currently training. So she will be reading a few excerpts from the book about that penalty. I would like also to thank very much all the honorable panelists and experts, and especially Cesare Romano, professor of law at Loyola Law School, who's tonight's moderator. He holds degrees in 3 different disciplines from Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. His expertise in international law with a focus on international human rights and international criminal and humanitarian law. He created, developed, and managed the project on international courts and tribunals, a joint undertaking of the Center on International Cooperation, New York University, and the Center for International Courts and Tribunals at University College London, becoming a world-renowned authority in the field. He decided to put his considerable knowledge on the law and procedure of international bodies to the service of victims of human rights violations. He founded the International Human Rights Clinic at Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. In 2014, he was given the Hidden Hero Award of the Center for Reconciliation and Justice for his work in the human rights field. So please, let me give the floor now to Cesare Romano.
For a world without the death penalty, Cities for Life. For years, by our commitment and initiatives, we have never been tiring, communicating, networking, creating a culture in order to spread our message. No justice without life. For years we have been growing, and more cities and people around the world have joined us. And the good news has not had to wait. We continue to work because as many as we will be, it will get nearer more and more, the moment on which it will be possible to say, we have changed the world. It is for building the future that this year, on the occasion of the World Day, Cities for Life, on November the 30th, more than 1,600 cities around the world will light up to say no to the death penalty. Why should you be present? Because each of us may rebel against the globalization of the indifference. And together we can positively influence policies on a global scale. How? Choose a place representative of your neighborhood or your town and ask the city council, the mayor, or the other competent authorities that on the occasion of November the 30th, or on a near date, it can be lit in a special way, as a living logo of the campaign. Organize conferences, concerts, events and fundraising in support of Cities for Life. Mobilize the media. Go on the Cities for Life communication channels. Watch the video of the campaign and follow all of the events in the calendar. Contact the Sant'Egidio community for any information. Cities for Life. Change the world, starting from your hometown.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Well, I will keep it simple and short. Today, we are here in this room to talk about, better? Right. To talk about Mario Marazziti's book, 13 ways of looking at the death penalty. Some of you have got a copy outside, and I also had the privilege of having it signed by the author. I read the book all in one shot this morning as I was on a flight back from New York, coming back to Los Angeles, and it was really intense reading, I must say. It really absorbed me, and I got lost in the stories. They are really touching, in the information, the data that is very comprehensive and very detailed, giving you an idea of exactly where we stand as humanity on the matter of death penalty in the year 2015. But also the human element. I never had the pleasure of meeting, if I can, Mario before in my life. But when I read the book this morning, I thought, tonight I'm going to meet an exceptional individual, someone who had a chance to dedicate his life, his commitment, to a very worthy cause, which is the abolition of death penalty throughout the world. Of course, I cannot expect anything less from an Italian. Like, we have a tradition of commitment to the abolition of death penalty. Indeed, as soon as I met Mario tonight and I introduced myself, he said, like, well, your last name is not Romano, your last name should be Beccaria. Yes, I indeed graced having the first name of Cesare Beccaria, who was the intellectual leader of the movement that led at the abolition of death penalty, first in Tuscany, and then eventually from there to the rest of the world. Mario is a member of the Italian Parliament, and actually I should say then Honorable Marazziti, right? And where he chairs the Committee on Human Rights of the Chamber of Deputies of the Italian Parliament, has been elected 2 years ago at the last round of the political elections. But before getting to that position, has been spending a professional life working for the Italian broadcast company, RAI, Radio Televisione Italiana, and also a lifelong commitment to the assistance of the people in need, and a personal commitment to his faith through the Comunità Sant'Egidio, which is not only a local player in Rome, very important, doing work very specific based on the city, but over the years has become a force in international relations, being able to broker dispute settlement agreements in a lot of conflicts, both domestic and international, throughout the world in all continents. So without much further ado, then I think I will wrap up my short presentation, and I will, right? Sorry? What did you say? Oh, right. Oh, right now? Okay, I thought I was going to do that later on. Okay, so let me introduce also the speakers, the panelists that we will have tonight, because of course this is an occasion to have I hope, what is going to be a very stimulating discussion on death penalty and its merits or demerits. The first is going to be Sarah Haley. Sarah is Assistant Professor of Gender Studies and African American Studies at UCLA. Right. Okay, sorry. Okay. Sarah has been working on the history of women and their imprisonment in the United States South. Please join us on the panel. And her book entitled Engendering Captivity, Race, Gender, and Punishment in Georgia After the Civil War will come out next spring with the University of North Carolina Press. She has been authoring also a number of articles on questions of women in culture and society, and has also worked at the New York office of the Federal Public Defender. The work as a public defender is something that also is a trait that has also been shared by another panelist tonight, who is my esteemed and dear colleague, Sean Kennedy. Sean, please stand up. Sean was the Federal Public Defender of the Central District of California, and he joined Loyola Law School in 2014 to become the director of the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy. And for those of you who are not familiar with the work of the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy, it's really one of the gems of our law school. Everyone is very proud of the work that the center has been doing over the years, and we have excited that now that Sean is at the helm. Of course, Sean is not an unknown face in our law school because actually he is a graduate himself of Loyola Law School. He did it he finished in 1986 and has been working, as I said, as a federal public defender until 2006. Third, Stephen, please. Stephen Rode, join us. Stephen is a practicing attorney and specializing in civil rights and civil liberties. He is also a member of the board of directors of Death Penalty Focus and is a chair emeritus of the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation of Southern California. Stephen studied law at Northwestern University and, political science, and he studied law at Columbia University at the law school in New York. He began his legal career in New York before moving to Los Angeles and has spent a significant amount of his life working on matters of constitutional law, civil liberties, and fundamental rights. He has been the author of American Words of Freedom and Freedom of Assembly, and has also wrote a large number of articles and studies on matters touching also on death penalty amongst the others. And finally, if I'm correct, last but not the least, we're going to have Mario Marazziti, please. All right, join us. All right, thank you.
So now we'd like to, the lights please. We'd like to have our guest of honor reading some pages from the book. Thank you so much, Maddalena Schiale.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maddalena Schiale, and I'm very honored to be here tonight. Mario, the Onorevole, maybe doesn't know, but it's not a coincidence I'm here tonight because in 2000, I just realized today when I was reading these pages, I was participating to actually collect all the signature. We had a goal with an association I was part of to really collect as signature as possible for the petition for the Comunità of Sant'Egidio. So today it's very emotional for me and very strange being here. Feels like there is a circle, and I would not expect that this circle will close here in Los Angeles because we were in Italy so far away. So it's a very nice coincidence, and I don't believe in coincidence, so maybe it's fate. So I'm going to read these for you, and forgive me if I get emotional. I'm an actress, we do that. So my first memory of death penalty is from 1960, when I was 8 years old. In California, a man named Carol Chessman was fighting the justice system without a lawyer, playing chess with the state. He had written several books, and his fame was such that Time magazine put his picture on its cover, and the Italian papers were following his story in the days leading up to his execution. When Chessman was put to death, the news story I read about, it included some sketches. The gas chamber, how it works, the poison pill sent from the top to a basin with water, the gas starting. The condemned man choking. I do not have many memories from those years, which were difficult ones in my life, but I still remember those sketches of a man dying in a gas chamber. A few years later, I joined a group of students who had begun to meet at the Chiesa Nuova, an old and much-loved Borromini church in the center of Rome, at the initiative of Andrea Riccardi, a student at the Virgilio, a nearby high school. One thing led to another, and the community of Sant'Egidio was formed, named after an abandoned convent in Rome that later became our headquarters. Over the years and the decades, the community took root in local communities in over 70 countries. We saw the spread of violence in big cities of the West and the global South. We saw the destructive power of the various clans of organized crime, from the Camorra to the Maras, and the sought solution. We sought solution. As we witnessed new friends becoming victims in civil wars, we participated in efforts to bring about reconciliation and peace in many countries of the world, and successfully brokered peace accords from Mozambique to Guatemala, from Burundi to the Ivory Coast, from Liberia to the Balkans, and from Kosovo to the Congo and El Salvador. We helped bring about a lasting preventive peace after a series of coups in Niger and the end of dictatorship in Guinea-Conakry. Why do wrongful convictions happen, and how often do they happen? Across the world, the death penalty is used to target political opposition and religious and social minorities. In South Korea, in recent decades, 2 former presidents have been sentenced to death, political retribution, by their successors after power changed hands. It happens to presidents, but much more often to ordinary people. Governments rely on a lack of reporting of these cases, as well as the typically poor quality of public legal defense, and a lack of expertise in death penalty jurisprudence on the part of both defense lawyers and the judges. When the accused is poor, the chances of a wrongful conviction soar. In the United States, a sophisticated and strong democracy in so many ways, wrongful execution is not a rare event, but a systemic problem. I have spoken with wardens, officials, people sentenced to death, relatives of victims and of convicts, police officers and observers, chaplains and spiritual advisors on that row, people in charge of the system, and human rights activists. I've asked them all how many of the people on that row might, in their opinions, be innocent. Their answers have led me to conclude that as many as 1 out of 7 people who are executed did not commit the crime for which they were sentenced to death. I am alive. I've understood a lot of things about life. As Nick Yaris put it to me while walking down the center aisle of the Basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere, after our prayer service one evening, I was an asshole, a jerk. I am not now. Nicholas Yaris, Nick, is very direct, not ashamed of anything. Tall, bold, and still handsome, he showed me pictures of himself with black hair, pictures from his life before. He speaks slowly and calmly, without drama, even if tears well up in his eyes. But I can't forget the evening at the Cities of Life World Day at the Colosseum. Afterwards, there were 5 or 6 of us walking back along the Via dei Fori Imperiali, a road that cuts the Roman Forum into 2 through what may be the most interesting archaeological area in the world. Towards the Piazza Venezia, a sort of crossroads at Rome's historical center. We were walking, all walking, side by side, but Nick was walking backwards. Sometimes he was taking pictures, other time just walking, but backwards. It was a little strange, but none of us said anything about it. I have no right to judge, I said to myself, because there is so much suffering behind it. Then Nick spoke up, as if answering the unspoken questions in our minds. Do you think it's strange that I am a strange guy? I haven't seen such a moon for 22 years. Haven't seen this wide, infinite sky with stars or this air, and the Colosseum all lit up. I don't want to miss 1 second of this. That's why I'm walking backwards. Nick spent 8,057 days on that row, and he read about 6,000 books, one every day or two. The rest of the time, he tried to keep from being killed by the state of Pennsylvania.
So let's start our conversation, and of course we would like to start with probably the question that everyone has in their mind right now in this room. Mario, why do you think United States still retains death penalty?
Well, there are many reasons. First, I do hope, seriously hope, that the United States are going to be without the death penalty. Something is changing, and it's changing fast. Over the last 7 years, 6 states abolished the death penalty. And for 30 years before then, no state had abolished the death penalty. So I think that there is a big change, and we are at the lowest rate of executions and also of sentences over the last 20 years, and it has been going down steadily. But I think that the death penalty in the United States, that is used mostly in the Bible Belt in the South, and let's say 5 states, these states where most executions take place, has something to do with slavery, the story of slavery in the South, a lot to do with a culture of guns, some to do with the idea of retributive justice and not restorative justice. So even if it can be ineffective, in any case I will give it to you. And then many lies. I think that the death penalty is a shortcut, a military shortcut for social problems. And that in too many states there is too little money for education and too much money for prisons. But at the end of the day, I think that the death penalty is in place because, unfortunately, too many top positions in the police, in the justice system, depend on elections. So so there is the problem of how the death penalty can be a symbolic way of trying to gain consensus, even if all the rationale says the contrary. So the death penalty has nothing to do with security, no relationship between the carve of deaths and the carve of executions. There is of crime. So I think that it is the summary of many lies, but substantially for political reasons, for. At the end of the day, I don't think that the death penalty is America. There are so many parts of America where the death penalty is not so popular. And I think that we can work on trying to get rid of the death penalty to create more America and not less America. But I started to write this book just because I wanted to interact with America, having discovered that there are so many things that I discovered in the world for many years that are normally not true and not available to an average American. And I would conclude my first answer saying the death penalty is based on many lies. The lie that if you do not kill the person, you are not reimbursing the family of the members from their sorrow. But if only 1 out of 100 homicides is punished with the death penalty, what about the other 99? Then it's another lie, because psychologists say that closure is always a process. Only for the death penalty, closure is a specific moment in which a person is killed. So they are freezing the families, preventing them from getting closure in the worst moment of their own life, the moment of the sorrow, waiting for a special magic moment. So psychologists should look in the mirror and say, why are we saying this thing only for the death penalty? Then it is based on many other lies. But the main lie is that what happens in the world will never affect America. And this is something that I discovered is completely untrue over the last 2 decades. And I wanted to give this gift to the American activists and to the American people, remembering them that it has been the Supreme Court of America that in 2003 and 2004 when they said that the death penalty for people who are mentally retarded or people who committed a crime when they were juveniles cannot be executed because it is inconstitutional. To justify this, to justify that the Supreme Court was saying something different from the very recent past, they said because it has changed the international standard of decency. So the change in the international standard of decency means that what happens in the world counts for America. So I think that there are many reasons. A fundamentalistic way of reading some lines of the Bible, for instance, that is not so different from a fundamentalistic way of reading some lines of the Quran or other fundamentalistic attitude of other people. But I think that nevertheless, probably we are not losing but winning this battle.
Well, that's great news. So if I may then ask a follow-up question, if it's a battle that is getting won step by step, as I was reading your book this morning, I was thinking, yeah, I like 13 ways of looking at death penalty, but if I can make a suggestion, I rather would like to read a book that tells me 13 ways to abolish death penalty or 13 reasons why not to have death penalty.
Well,
how are we going to win this battle for good?
Well, the first thing is that I wanted to write a book that was containing different angles. This is why 13 ways of looking at, because it is not a judgmental book. It is sort of gifts back to America by Italians, European people who saw the death penalty disappear from the European continent, but also this piece of news is not known in America. So many people always ask me, is it true that there is not the death penalty in Italy? Not in Europe. So it's useful to spread the good news. But Europe abolished the death penalty probably because in Europe there was too much death. So the First World War, the Second World War, the War of 100 years, and so always in the same area. The Shoah, the killing, enough. Very important word in Italian, also in English, basta. Basta. And then, and Europe was helped by America to defeat the Nazis and so on. So somehow we feel that our fellow friends and brothers and sisters, Americans, should receive this gift, this awareness, as a gift back, not as a judgment on American society. So, 13 Ways of Looking at the Death Penalty, I stick with the title. The last chapter has 13 ways to defeat the death penalty, but if I tell you now the 13 ways of abolishing the death penalty, you would not buy the book.
Exactly, that's the ultimate spoiler. All right. Shall I start, please?
Yes, I can stop now talking, but before the precious experts here give us their comments, I asked the Italian Institute of Culture that has been so kind to organize this very high quality meeting to show us and to share with you 6 minutes of a dialogue with Nick Yaris, the man that the last reading was describing with words, but 6 minutes to listen from him, 22 years on death row, innocent. What was life about on death row? So, and then we can go to the next part of the meeting.
Is it a special feeling to walk in a street and look all the people walking,
Sometimes, but
making shopping, or
no, the big moments come when I wake up and it's a new day. That's the best feeling. Because I woke up and it's not a dream. Like I didn't wake back up in my cell, because I used to dream so hard that sometimes I would think that in my sleep that I was free. Like I dreamed the free dreams. And then I would wake up and I'd still be there, so it was like really hard. So now when I wake up, that's the best part, you know.
you can open the window.
Open the window, sleep in bed, hungry.
Hungry. How did you spend your daily life, I mean, in 23 years?
At first, very angry, very angry. I wasn't allowed to speak in my own cell. I would be put into my cell every day and told, shut up, you couldn't talk. For the first 2 years of my sentence, I didn't say a word.
You were
In
alone
silence, in total silence,
for 2 years.
for 2 years. And I was really, really angry. But later on, I got this thing happened to me that made me strong. And I decided that I was going to win at any cost this fight. But I was going to do it by making myself a really good person. So I had to let go of the anger. You cannot be angry. So every day I went to school. That's what I like to say. I learned something. I read. I went to college for 6 years. I did everything I could to grow. So every day I went to school. That's what it was like. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, but what do you mean? You read, but you were always on your own,
Right.
alone,
Alone,
in the
solitary
cell.
confinement. But I had the ability with books, music, art. I taught myself art.
How many books did you read?
I stopped counting after 9,000.
After 9,000.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
So books help to avoid to become crazy.
Yeah, music kept me sane. Every day of my life, over the last 14 years, I never touched another human being. if I was taken out of my cell, they put me on a leash like an animal. So I never touched anyone. Do you understand?
Yes.
But in my mind, I didn't let that bother me because I used my mind to fulfill all these feelings in other ways. I felt music, I felt literature, I felt art, I felt the rain, I felt because I couldn't touch human beings.
How long is one day? More than 24 hours.
No,
There.
no, I'll tell you what it is. It's the blink of an eye. Because if you're not careful, 20 years passes. So it's crazy. I was so good at escaping in my mind that days would pass by, years passed.
What freedom does it mean for you now? It's a special word or not?
Oh, it is so special. I'll tell you what freedom is. Freedom is being unafraid. If you think about it, the things that you're afraid of are your prison. If you're afraid of something so large, it locks you up. But if you're not afraid, and I am not afraid, after the things I've lived through, I'm not afraid of nothing.
Let's talk about torture. Because you were talking about the classroom, art classroom, but the real life in the death row, it's...
You mean when they did stuff like that to me? When they crushed my hand? A prison guard did that to me.
Why?
He said that's what rapist murderers deserve. How do you hate someone that feeds you? Yeah, I know what torture is like. You know what torture is? It's the ability to be a good person. You know how hard it is to be a good person? When people are trying to murder you?
Okay. Well, that was very powerful. Thank you. So,
Just without talking.
well, at least you can help me passing the microphone around. Okay, thank you. So I would like to start our conversation from Sarah, and I would like to connect with something that Mario suggested before. So he said that one of the reasons why that penalty hasn't been abolished yet in the United States has to do with long-seated cultural issues, and one of historical also, one of those that he mentioned is slavery. So can you please elaborate on that connection? Or do you agree with it? You don't agree?
I absolutely agree. My only difference, I think, would be that you were so generous to the United States and to our history of what you called a series of lies, right? A series of fictions. And those fictions are historically constructed and they are persistent. And it's the creation of historical subjects who are, as Agamben would say, bare life, right? Who are monstrous, sort of wayward subjects and institutionalized through the death penalty. And so one of the things that was most powerful to me about this book was a particular line that I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but it's to the effect of when the state executes a serial killer, it becomes a killer, right? And so we want to think about how to think about society, to think about the state, to think about politics through the lens of those historically constructed as monsters, right, as those bearing no lives. And I think that's what lawyers consider mitigation, right? Here are the structural or personal characteristics of people who that bear some relevance, right? Why they should not be executed. But what history teaches us, and particularly the scholarship of Angela Davis, who herself was on death row, and W.E.B. Du Bois, what their scholarship teaches us historically about the United States is that the abolition of slavery was only enacted in this country in a very limited sense. In other words, the 13th Amendment was passed, eliminating slavery except as punishment for a crime, but we can't call that abolition democracy because the creation of structures of life for living, life-sustaining institutions were not created alongside that, right? And so because of that, we're creating the condition for acts and behaviors that then the state deems intolerable and resolves through the death penalty. The other thing I think that's important about this question of history and the construction of historical subjects who are considered expendable is the relationship between the death penalty and broader judicial regimes of state violence and death. So, for example, thinking about the history of slavery, 91% of African Americans who are killed by police are found justifiable, right? Can we call that an extrajudicial system? I think not, right? That's part of a continuum of the death penalty that is completely judicial. There is nothing extra about it when 91% of those killings are deemed justifiable. So what we have is an expansive, deeply entrenched historical system of state elimination, really. And yet what is so optimistic about this book and your activism and so inspiring is the potential, right, for progress through a kind of global scrutiny, right, of these practices. So.
Thank you, Sarah. Mario, do you want to?
Just about optimism is only, I think it's important to know, because sometimes many friends of mine, many activists, many human rights organizations, many good people do not know, even themselves, that just in the 70s, only 25 countries had abolished the death penalty in the world. And that for the previous 2,000 years, practically all the countries of the world had used the death penalty with very few exceptions for very short periods. And over the last 40 years, but especially over the last 20 years, we are now at more than 150 countries that are not using by law definitively or practically the death penalty. So there is an acceleration in history that is completely not unexpected, but beyond imagination. So I think that sometimes we need some good news to find the energy to talk to others, to convince ourselves to do the right things. That's it.
Thank you. So my question for Sean is that, again, tying back to something that Mario mentioned before. So we know that the decision in 2004 whereby the Supreme Court declared death penalty imposed on people who committed crimes at the times were juvenile as unconstitutional is definitely a landmark in this long march towards the abolition of death penalty. Is there something else that could be possibly done in judicial system in terms of advocacy and cases that could be built to try to push the boundary a little bit more, push the Supreme Court to do a little bit more in that direction?
Yeah, I think there is. As a working death penalty lawyer, I've been amazed by the progress that has come. The U.S., of course, abolished the death penalty, the Supreme Court, in 1972, and the backlash from the electorate was so strong. Literally every state, every newspaper was appalled. And so while the court had said in Furman that the evolving standards of decency were such that it looked like the death penalty was arbitrary and unconstitutional, by 1976 it was back with a vengeance. And so we thought that it was back, but then of late, the U.S. Supreme Court, which is just a intensely conservative and pro-death penalty court, has issued a lot of really sweeping limitations on the death penalty. First, we saw the elimination of the death penalty for people with intellectual disability. And that was in the Atkins decision. Later on, we see the elimination of the death penalty as a violation of the Eighth Amendment for juveniles, which was absolutely groundbreaking in Roper versus Simmons. And we've also recently seen the abolition of the death penalty, it appears, for any crime except murder, when it declared it an Eighth Amendment violation to give the death penalty for child rape, which was unknown. And so the court has been restricting the death penalty more and more. And I believe the next wave of litigation and rights will be such that the neuroscience tells us, and anyone who teaches 20-somethings will know this, so I know that 18 is not magic. And in fact, people are very impulsive and have a different brain structure until their mid-20s. I think the young women, it's about 23. It takes the guys about 3 years to catch up, so 25 to 26. And so a lot of the science, the neuroscience, that was introduced to make the Eighth Amendment attacks on the juvenile death penalty will be used for that range, 18 to 25, and also people with similar mental illnesses, if you can prove they suffer from the same deficits that mentally retarded people do. So serious mental illness will be analogized to intellectual disability, and people who are of legal age but still very young will be analogized to juveniles. And there's a lot of hope for that. There's also a lot of backlash. The U.S. stood alone with Somalia and Iran in the United Nations fighting for the right to keep the death penalty for juveniles. And so most of the progress that has been made in the past few decades has been from sweeping decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court, usually in a 5-4 vote. And so I think that we'll continue to see that movement push further and further for more restrictions. The upside is the death penalty becomes more and more infrequently used in the United States. In the 60s or the 50s, you could have the death penalty for rape, robbery, armed robbery, murder. It almost always is racial, as the speakers have alluded to. It's heavily given to black defendants whose victims, violent crimes are white, and the number one factor for anyone trying a death penalty case is looking at the jury and saying, are there 5 white males or more on the jury? Because the chances of getting death go way up if there are. But the restrictions on the death penalty under the prism of the evolving standards of decency has been enormously successful for restricting it. And the question is, at some point in time, will the evolving standards of decency be such that it's abolished altogether? I'm skeptical. The death penalty is as American as apple pie. It's very much about black, white, north, south, urban, rural America. So many of our conversations about the death penalty in this country have nothing to do with the actual death penalty. They have to do with the underlying things that led to it. On the other hand, the whole world has gone one way and we've gone another. And at some point in time, one has to think that the U.S. Supreme Court will decide enough is enough.
Thank you. Mario, do you want to react to that? Okay, Stephen, then my question to you is that, like probably everyone in this room, I was appalled when just, I think it was 2 years ago, here in California, the proposition that was attempting to have that penalty repeal failed to prevail at the ballot. And
everyone was shocked?
I was shocked. I think everyone was shocked because, we tend to think of California as being a little bit different than they say from Texas, just to name one state.
Welcome to California.
Right, exactly. Then again, probably it's simply I don't know California well enough. So, is this going to be, since that you are an activist and has been a leader in the movement behind the proposition, and what's going to be the next step? Are we trying again? In what form? With what timeline? What do you think is going to happen?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Institute for having us here tonight and giving me a chance to reconnect with Mario. Before I say that, I am recovering from a deep chest cough, which has a will of its own and explodes unannounced, so you'll forgive me. I will try to keep it under control. But I promised myself I had to be here tonight because everything we've talked about is emblematic that when the history of the demise of the death penalty is written, when it is written for California, when it is written for the United States, and when it is written for the world, the dedication in that book must include Mario Marazzetti. It is, as an activist, we first met in 2000 in San Francisco, and Mario opens his book talking about that conference. And it was the first world conference and to be held in San Francisco, a city of peace. The idea among American activists that there were people like Mario and his community and communities across the world that were waking up every day to help us abolish the death penalty in America was an extraordinary boost. It was an extraordinary gift. This book is a gift. Mario's continuous work is a gift. And of course, he does this for the world. And to see the day that every country is civilized enough to remove state killing. But I do believe we are at a turning point in these large public policy questions. It may not come because the United States Supreme Court abolishes the death penalty. It may come because voters who have voted it in and legislators who have voted it in vote it out. So we have a track of the legal work that is being done, and we have a track of the activists. But the tipping point is connected, because I woke up this morning and the lead editorial, bless their hearts, at the New York Times is 152 innocents marked for death. And once again, the New York Times has collected the information of the known 152 innocent people that have been exonerated, including 2 others who are innocent, who we know have been executed, let alone all of those who are probably innocent, who were actually executed. So this is the cover of a national American newspaper today, and it shows you why this issue is commanding attention of people across the country. It's because it is a human issue. Tonight in this audience is a man, a good friend of mine, Tom Goldstein, who was sentenced for murder that he did not commit, and he spent 24 years of his life in prison. Thank God he wasn't sentenced to death, because he lived long enough to prove his innocence and to be released and to hold the counties of Long Beach and Los Angeles accountable for what they did to him. So this is an extremely human issue. It was in 2012. Not that I was shocked by the result, I was sad by the result, but 48% of California voters, the first time abolition of the death penalty had come to a vote, 48% voted for it. A huge public policy question, a huge law and order question, and we were able to rally within 2% of having the people of the state of California speak and abolish the death penalty. Work is underway to explore returning to the ballot in 2016. You will hear about this. I want the mailing list of tonight's audience as a good activist, because I want every one of you to consider the 13 ways of abolishing the death penalty. I think we can move people who understand the lies that support the death penalty and the truths that support alternatives to the death penalty, which can certainly keep us safe. And we can explore those tonight as well.
Thank you, Stephen. So I think it would be good to open to questions from the audience. I have a mobile microphone, and I need to see some hands. All right, sorry, I'm shielding my eyes. I see two there. Please, can you identify yourself and then ask a question?
My name is Chuck Giunta, and my family is from Sicily many, many years ago. I always used to wonder what would happen when modern technology, real modern technology, started butting against the Bible for facts. And I always wondered about that, and now I know. When you have the Bible, which says an eye for an eye, now what you want is those people to change that Bible. And I don't know how you're going to do that. But I think that's the crux of it, an eye for an eye. The separation of church and state doesn't exist anymore. We can see throughout the country when it comes to abortion, when it comes to gays. And if you go into the Bible, you know what the Bible says about those people. So that's where your fight is.
All right, thank you very much. Since I'm not a religious authority, I will not speak about the Bible and what it says and what it does not. Mario, do you?
I don't know if to collect more than one question and then...
All right. Okay.
I can answer this because I saw some hands. Yes.
All right.
I like to answer this question, by the way. So in a minute I will arrive with that.
I'm Pearl Ricci, and I'm so pleased that you're here, and I think this is such a wonderful issue. In the 1970s, I worked for a California legislator who supported the abolition of the death penalty. We represented a very liberal area, Beverly Hills, and this area of Los Angeles.
Alan Cerroti?
No, Congressman Howard Berman.
Good.
Okay, so I was amazed at the number we lost. And in this particular area, which is probably one of the most liberal areas of Los Angeles, it was not popular. It was so, I have so many incidents I can tell you that happened while I worked in this office. My point is that if this is the most liberal and the most intelligentsia, and this is the most bluest state we have so far, why do we still have so many people with the NRA, so many people? And one of my things is it possible that the media, I think my feeling is that the media and what the movies are putting out with this idea of an eye for an eye and vengeance. And my question is, how do you overcome this? How do you tell the average American, John, whatever his name is?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I will try to answer to this then if anyone wants to say something more. But first about the Bible. Actually, I think that the Bible on the death penalty is not an enemy. So we do not even need, let's say, hyper technology to have another source that helps us to find reasons to stop this barbaric way of applying so-called justice that is not justice. I start to say normally that justice that kills is never justice, because in my opinion it's at the very root of the concept of justice is how to protect life. And this is why laws do exist, to protect each of us from our worst moments, let's say. Okay, so this is why the state exists. It is why the modern state exists, why the modern laws do exist. By the way, so I think that the Bible is not an enemy in this case, because the Bible contains evolution inside the Bible. So this is why I was speaking about a fundamentalistic way of reading the Bible, just sticking to a line or to some passages. First, no religions is ever only the books. Every religion, whatever is the religion, are the books, the tradition, real life, contemporaneity. So while when we speak of religions, we normally speak of the books, which is another stupid way of speaking of religions, but it is the common way in which not our culture speaks about religions, each religion. Second, inside the Bible, the text of the Bible, there is evolution, because we start with misproportionate revenge, 70 times 7. That means almost infinite revenge. Then it arrives the Talion law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that is proportionate punishment. And that is a good evolution. I do not like it, but it was an incredible big change in the history of civilization. Then inside the Bible, for instance, there is the book of Job. It is when inside the Bible it starts to appear the idea of eternal life. So because inside the Bible, not many know that, and for the Jewish world at the time of Jesus, some groups, many groups, did not believe in a future life, eternal life. So the book of Job contains that life is in the hands of God, so not in the hands of human beings. So when people say, okay, we will see what God does with life later, but we have to apply justice. We are here, we are human beings. And so well, this is not very consistent. Then we have Jesus and so on. So inside the Bible, in my opinion, is not an enemy on the death penalty. And about the second question is, let's say, we have a problem of public opinion, media, simplification that sometimes bring about arguments in favor of he deserves it. He did it, he deserves it. This is very basic. This is very simplified. So simplification is not explanation. So simplification very often is how to make a very complicated thing not understandable, but just covering the complexity. So and then I think that we need, in many countries, democratic countries, polls, public opinion are used to say and to justify the use of violence and of the death penalty. But I think that democracies are not just polls. Democracies, there is a difference. Alex Tocqueville has a couple of pages on the difference between democracy and populistic democracy. It is amazing because television was not existing, the internet was not existing at that time, but if you put the words television, media, or new media, the 2 pages are even more clear, are almost prophetic. So democracy is weights, counterweights. You need something for public opinion, independence of the justice system, and so on. And not just polls, not just the number of votes. That is one of the elements of democracy, not democracy. And I think that we need to have leadership, not just followship. That's problem. So that's it. So the only way to change is not just to have, of course, if public opinion changes in a massive way, this is another way to win this battle. But we can win also in another way without this happening. That's it.
Do you want to answer the second question? We have sometimes said that support for the death penalty is a mile wide and an inch thick. It was remarkable in the 2012 election that if you could sit down, if you could talk to people about the issues, if you could disabuse them of the myths that it's not a deterrent, that states with the death penalty and countries with the death penalty have much higher rates of murder and homicide than states without the death penalty and countries without the death penalty, that it's more expensive to impose the death penalty than life in prison without possibility of parole. People initially won't believe you when you say that until you cite the studies of the FBI and journalists and other organizations of the risk of executing innocent people. So when you get to sit with people and talk to them and cut through the cacophony of the media in so many ways, we know examples of this. A wonderful writer, Scott Turow, who's written various legal crime novels and others, was appointed to an Illinois commission on the death penalty. And it was a bipartisan commission, supporters of the death penalty, opponents of the death penalty. And Scott Turow is a former prosecutor. And he was appointed to the Illinois Commission as a pro-death penalty advocate. And he sat through the hearings, and he listened to the witnesses, and he listened to the diversity of opinion among victims' families, members who are not monolithic, many of whom oppose the death penalty and would not impose further killing because of the killing of their loved one. And Scott Turow changed his mind. And he wrote a small volume, you can find it in the library, of his evolution in coming to oppose the death penalty. So I think whatever optimism you may be feeling tonight, and what the optimism we took from the 2012 election here, is that you can speak to people. You can change minds. And to the extent that they begin to understand the lies and the truths, they will realize that better public policy, that more money can be put into crime prevention and literacy and the causes of crime than in the punishment by the death penalty. And that's how the evolving standards of decency and the tipping point occur.
There. 1 and 2. What? First here.
Hi. I'm from San Francisco, and I consider myself a liberal left-wing person, but I have conflicts on this issue because while I'm against the death penalty for normal criminals because of the history, especially in America, of racism and of inequality of socioeconomic issues, I find it hard to apply the same principle in certain instances, such as Timothy McVeigh, or Adolf Hitler, or Bin Laden, or Ted Bundy. And I was curious to your opinions in respect to that.
Well, okay. If my answer is not complete tonight, tomorrow at noon, I will be at Book Passage at the Ferry Building in San Francisco, so just in case. No, but I think that, well, first of all, the elimination of the dictator, let's say, sometimes has some side effects that would be better to consider before. Let's think of Gaddafi, okay, and what we have now in Libya. So I'm not pretty sure that was a big idea to do that, okay. In any case, whatever was the evil that he may have done. But the second thing is that I think that the bottom line is that we must decide that the state and civil society must never be like them. That's it. So if we admit that under special circumstances we can kill a person, we now may say that the special circumstances is a dictator and a super killer, okay? But another person can decide that the special circumstances are the circumstances that the dictator is deciding that are special circumstances. So I think that we must decide that the state can never legitimize a culture of death. Because if the states declare that there are some exceptions, while it was defend life, it legitimates a culture of death. That is exactly what wants to fight against. In my opinion, there are no others, so never like them. Then there are many practical observations, because when you arrest the worst dictator, let's say, the worst killer, from that moment on, that person is has very little chances, opportunities to make harm again, and that it is not legitimate revenge, a legitimate defense, because the risk is not there anymore. And there is such a misproportion of power between the state and the prisoner that is, the words are not mine, but let's say somehow Dostoevsky and Camus in different ways say the same thing. There is the same difference that there is between a prison and an extermination camp, the difference between dying and executions. So because there is a scientific construction that adds much more evil in the action of the state than in the evil done by a crazy or bad person. So I would say simply that it's better to mark a difference. We never will be like them. This is what I think about the Boston sentence. So it's clear that it was him, but it's better not.
Right. I remember I read the headlines on the newspapers the other day when the guilty verdict came down, and I was in New York. I think it was the New York Post, or yeah, that was the titles that he has been found guilty. Now the real question: should he die? It's unfortunately the debate is still at that level. So that okay, down there.
What I wanted to ask you was that, do you have any substitute for the death penalty?
Well, I actually think that the only the substitute is, of course, imprisonment. I personally against life imprisonment without parole. I think that we must always conceive the possibility that people, in any case, can change or can reimburse society in some ways. I don't think that's my. I think that life imprisonment is a serious thing. So it's not a game. And
I know, but I don't think it's a simple issue, with all due respect, as to what that actual penalty is that replaces the death penalty. And I think you have to think about that before you get wider acceptance of abolishment of the death penalty.
So maybe I have not understood your question. Maybe.
What is the replacement for the death penalty? If it's not the death penalty, what is it? And there's a number of options there, and that's what needs to be looked at.
Right, and the others may have something to add. In California, we have life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over 3,000 people.
He doesn't understand my question. Excuse me, I don't think you understand my question.
I guess neither of us.
Let me just finish my question.
Yes,
okay.
sorry.
And the question is to consider the options for the death penalty.
All right. Do you
Yes.
think you're being clear enough now? Okay.
You're asking for punishment options as an alternative to the death penalty. Okay. And I'm telling you that in California, we have life in prison without the possibility of parole. 3,000 people have been convicted and sentenced to that form of punishment. None of them has ever been released. There are debates over whether you write someone off for the rest of their lives with no hope of rehabilitation, but for the present time, we have that alternative, and many states have that alternative. Abolitionists do not claim that in a lawful trial with due process and a fair methodology, if a person is found responsible for a crime, that they shouldn't be accountable, and that society shouldn't be able to mete out punishment subject to all those conditions that I've set. So we absolutely have an alternative. Texas only recently gave juries the alternative of life in prison, and other states also have either determinate sentences or long sentences.
I was a public defender 23 years, so I've represented, so many people on death row, and my experience is that death row inmates are like everyone else. Some you go up to San Quentin or federal death row, and you're like, why are you here? I don't understand it. And if they had the chance for parole, as they age, they get less and less problematic. That's just the way we all evolve. And then others are incredibly difficult people, and you're like, oh, you are so frustrating. And so I think the practical option, we have the rest of the industrialized world to look at. Most nations have a cap of about 30 years. In our state, the jury weighs at the penalty phase. Once you're convicted of capital murder, the jury, and only the jury, this is one of the reasons the death penalty is constitutional, makes the decision. It's not elites, it's not judges, it's a jury that, and they decide life in prison without parole or death. And so that's the practical option that exists right now. But most nations that have abolished the death penalty, and we really are extraordinary on the globe retaining it. And when you look at industrialized democracies, we're more than extraordinary. We virtually stand alone. And most people impose a maximum of about 30 years for any crime, including murder. They do differentiate between ordinary domestic crime and so-called crimes against the state. And I think that's another thing we're going to see with the abolitionist movement, taking that very small set of crimes that are extraordinary mass murder or treasonous murder or some kind of genocide, and saying that's a special category. But in the US, most death penalty crimes are felony murder, robbery, murder, overwhelmingly amounts for the death verdicts. And so I think the option is some kind of very long prison term that is parolable with a parole authority making that decision who ought to be released and when. That's difficult because sometimes parole boards are wrong, but overwhelmingly they're right. And the older people get and the longer they spend in incarceration, the better the chance they are when they get out. There will always be a small subset that will be a so-called continuing danger to society. And that's what the trials and the parole determinations focus on. And the challenge for the juries and the parole boards that do it is, in our country often, ascertaining future danger turns on issues of race and racial stereotypes.
I think I'm going to say something that few people will like, but that's okay, because I'm generally in that position, which is I think the two questions are related, the last two questions, because there's a question of the practicality and there's a question of a philosophical commitment to abolition. And I think that those of us who really have a fundamental critique of mass incarceration, it doesn't mean the absence of anger, either at state actors or at individuals, or the absence of an emphasis on accountability. I think both anger and accountability are critical and central to the project of challenging mass incarceration, of which the death penalty abolition is a part. But I do think that what we have done for the last 200 years is focus on a specifically narrow question of what to do with those people who have been historically constructed as villains, as wayward, as abject, heinous people. That is the question we have been focused on for the last 200 or more years of our criminal punishment system. And I think that what we have a mandate to do, and what is so inspiring about the book, is to have a paradigm shift and think about the philosophy of what real prevention means, what it means to create structures in society that actually are preventing crime, that are actually creating life-sustaining institutions. If the opposite of the death penalty is life, as we say, then I think that we do have an obligation to focus on those questions if we're part of a sort of constructed community of those who are committed to a certain project of justice, which means racial justice, or it means ending economic inequality. And that's because actually I have a book about the history of punishment in Georgia, in which the Georgia Pardoning Board was almost always wrong. It was like almost always wrong, including the only woman to be executed in Georgia, who was Lena Baker. And I'll make this very brief, but she was a black woman who worked as basically a healthcare aide for a white man named Ernest Knight. She was taking care of him as he was recuperating from a broken leg in 1945. And as her employer, he would lock her up in a grist mill, which he owned, a mill in which, he was turning grain into flour. And he'd lock her up and keep her there under his complete sexual and economic control. And she killed him. And she said it was either commit suicide or try and get out of there. Now, we may think of this as a historical story about segregation at different moments of white supremacy. Of course, the relations between employer and employee were completely out of bounds, and this was under Jim Crow, and so she was sentenced to death, executed, remains the only woman executed in Georgia, and of course, this is an aberrational story. But people are going to look back at us in 50 years, right, and think about all of the stories in this moment, right, that could be described in those same terms, that are about economic conditions, right, that are about relations of power. And so I think we have to think about it within that historical framework and about the vision of the world we want to see.
I wanted to add a few comments to the question that came here. Sometimes we need to listen to the victims' families on all sides of these issues, and you mentioned Timothy McVeigh. Bud Welsh lost his daughter in the Oklahoma bombing. And the first thing he wanted to do, if he could have ever gotten his hands on Timothy McVeigh, was to strangle him himself. He thought deeply about his daughter, who was against the death penalty. He went through something of a transformation. And on the night of Timothy McVeigh's execution, Bud Welsh has told us that he knew he could be nowhere else but sitting at the home of Timothy McVeigh's father. Because Timothy McVeigh's father was about to lose his son in a deliberate, calculated process of months and years, knowing the day and time that that father's son would be killed. And Bud Welsh had seen that it would do no good to execute Timothy McVeigh. It would do no good for his own daughter, and he was with Timothy McVeigh's father when Timothy McVeigh was executed. I think there is a universality of abolition. Our international treaties, for example, when it comes to torture, say there is no defense of necessity, no state of war, no insurrection, no justification can justify torture. And that principle, that we are better than the detainees, we are better than the people we arrest and convict, that we are not going to model our behavior over the killers, we are going to model our behavior over those with faith and hope, as Mario has said.
Grazie. I want just to add one thing, because the issue that was raised is important, the alternatives and so on. I want to say that for all of us, it's clear that the worst crime that is possible is a genocide, crimes against humanity. Let's say what happened in the extermination camps during the Second World War or other genocides. Over the last 2 decades, about 10 years ago, the world gave itself the International Tribunal for Crimes Against Humanity, Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, Burundi, and so on. But the international community that decided to create this tribunal after many years decided that for crimes against humanity there will be no death penalty. I think it's very important that, and if the world set for itself this standard, America did not ratify this. Of course, America leads many battles for human rights worldwide, but America is not with that. I can understand because there are contradictions inside America, but that this is the standard that the world has given itself, I think it's important to know, and I think that is something that makes sense, because, for instance, Rwanda and Burundi, but also Cambodia, Kampuchea, came out from genocides, deciding no death penalty, because it is the way of breaking the cycle of revenge and to start reconciliation. That's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Are we supposed to? Right. I don't want to do the international law professor, but there's one thing that I can actually gloss and add to what you just said. Although it's true that the United States has not ratified the statute of the International Criminal Court, which does not provide, amongst punishments, death penalty, it's also true that the United States, as a member of the UN Security Council, voted on 2 resolutions on the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, neither of which has the possibility of imposing death penalty. So if you read in that a sign of the attitude of the United States as a matter of international law, you could possibly even argue that the United States as a federal government, as a matter of international law, is indeed inclined to believe that there is such a thing as a prohibition on the global level of death penalty. Then when it comes to what happens within the border of the United States, then it's completely different matter. But as far as international law is concerned, I would not read United States behavior as to be so negative as it seems to be.
It's very encouraging. Yes.
All right, probably we have, yes, one time for one question. So I have the unfortunate duty to pick the person, the lucky one. Well, there's a lady, and the lady must have the right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm a Swiss TV journalist. I'm also mounting an exhibition of death row inmates' paintings and drawings about their daily life on death row, about things that how about solitary confinement and other issues. This with a cartoonist of the International New York Times, whose name is Chapat. So this took us to many states, Utah, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Ohio, visiting prisons and talking to inmates. And that led us to the issue of what's going to happen now that some states don't have the lethal pharmaceutical anymore to put people to death. And in those states, they're talking about the electric chair, as you know, and other means, and also the squad, and also even gas chambers. Do you think this campaign helps the US get rid of the death penalty, or do you think the fact that those pharmaceuticals are not available, it's going to lead certain, perhaps, inmates to be killed in terrific ways?
Well, I will be very short, but I think that what's going on with the shortage of the drugs, one of the principles of the killing cocktail that is used for lethal injections, unfortunately, is something that I know directly, because at the very beginning, there is something that I did myself, because when the Hospira America, Illinois and New Jersey decided to stop the production of pentobarbital, pentotal, it was because Hospira subsidiary in Italy was producing that drug, and because I had been told by the friends of Reprieve America that this was the case. And then I worked very hard with our friends of Hands of Cain, but with the Minister of Health and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to create sanctions in any case if the drug would arrive on death row, even if it was not a direct act of the producer of the drug, but an action of the distributor. So this is why Hospira decided, also because it's a pharmaceutical company that should produce drugs for life, not for death, they immediately decided to stop. This created the first de facto moratorium for a while in America, and this is the chaos of the botched executions today and so on. So I feel guilty, but I think that these things are going to show every American a little more how barbaric the process is. So I think that this is something that is going to contribute to the reduction and to the question mark about the death penalty. I hope so.
Lethal injection was instituted in the late 70s after the death penalty was deemed constitutional after the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional 4 years earlier. Most people think that it was done as an innovation for a more humane form of execution, but in fact the state of Oklahoma, where it emanated from, had a broken electric chair, and they were told that it was going to cost somewhere like $50,000 to repair the electric chair and $250,000 to build a gas chamber, or $11 to do lethal injection. They adopted lethal injection, and that's why it's become so popular in the United States and in China, because it's perceived to be a very inexpensive method of execution. Since the litigation has begun, it has become enormously expensive, with the European companies refusing to sell the drugs, purchasing drugs in India and other places, FDA seizing drugs from state wardens, and huge amounts of money being spent by various litigants to litigate lethal injection. Therefore, the main reason for adopting that three-drug cocktail, which has no medical basis, has become undermined. And so I think we're going to see many states hearken back to prior methods of execution out of anger about the moratorium and the litigation tactics of abolitionists and people representing death row inmates. The question is whether it'll be successful. And I don't know. I'm hoping Mario's right.
Do you think it's vulnerable, the firing squad or other forms are vulnerable to an Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment test?
Well, Utah recently had a firing squad execution by election of the death row inmate, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it. But I do believe that the old discarded methods of execution will be subject to a second round of cruel and unusual punishment attacks.
I do, in answer to your question, I agree with Mario. I think the American people, there's a vast number of decent American people who have simply ignored the reality of the death penalty. 900 people have been sentenced to death in California. 13 of them have been executed in the modern era. So we have been able to push this aside, to ignore it in vast numbers of communities, and not see the reality of thinking of a firing squad. But do you realize that there are over 700 people on California's death row? If we ever resumed executions in California, if all of our efforts failed, if all of our voting efforts failed, if all of our legal efforts failed, and this penalty was upheld, and the lethal injection or some other form was reinstituted, we would have to execute one person a week for approximately 14 years to kill 700 people. I don't think the people want that blood on their hands. They don't want to think they are living in a medieval time when people were hung in the town square as a form of show and entertainment and blood and circuses. So I think the reality of that we are killing people, that the state is killing people through the death penalty when there are alternatives, is part of this emerging tide that will lead people to realize that they have it within their power to join all of these industrial and other civilized countries around the world to remove this abomination.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.